So this is the third part of the ninth lecture series, and I'd like to return to a topic we've sort of talked about at different levels throughout the course, which is the idea of these structural holes. And we're going to think about both the sort of way in which brokerage and constraint are working at a theoretical level as sources of power and control, and also how that can then those can contribute to the processual mechanism of actor certification. So, first of all, if you remember back when we first started thinking about some of the establishment concepts in bargaining, one of the things that we noticed is that, in fact, the same structural position of being in between two people who aren't necessarily talking to one another um, can really manifest itself in two different ways. And a lot of the particular manifestations in a particular sort of social context or organizational context will depend on the perceived or enacted power dynamics. So if it's the case that, say, person A is in between B and C, but can in some ways leverage power over both B and C, so a sort of divide and conquer scenario, you can actually be something of a power broker, right? The person A can get play B and C off of one another, right? If B and C can't coordinate, if you remember back to that idea, um, and can derive some surplus or benefit from that. However, if A and C is instead sort of seen to be answering to both, A is seen to be answering to both B and C, then you can get more of this stuck in the middle. So this is more the situation of a of someone who has, say, a dotted line relationship to one boss and the other boss. Both people think that they can tell them what to do, and so A can feel very torn into two pieces, can sort of get a deer in headlights. But what you can see is that a lot of this will depend on both either real levels of power, like can C punish A, can B punish A, and in what ways, but also these sort of more informal ways that we can imagine A, B, and C sort of trying to assert some power dynamic. It's often the case that it's somewhat ambiguous how much power. If C needs A to do something, then A still has power over C because they're dependent in some way on them, right? This is always the tricky part. So if there's A has a certain specialty, then they can sort of fight back in a certain way. If A has ties, in addition, we're sort of only looking at this triad here, but if A has ties outside to people who say can best both B and C, which we sort of saw this is part of some of the dynamics going on, for example, in Brazil in action, then again, you can get more power. So part of what we want to look at in a case is not just sort of a static view of how much relative power A, B, and C, but how A actually navigates that over time in order to try to capture the power that exists in the structural whole, even if he or she isn't necessarily granted it de facto. So again, the idea is what we're interested in is the navigation of structural holes, because they can be a source of both power and pressure. But there can be deliberate attempts to reframe, to reduce the pressure and demands from others. For example, if you're very clever and you're A, you could say to B, I'm sorry, I can't do this for you because I'm already committed to C. You can say to C, I'm sorry, I can't do this for you because I'm already committed to B. And if they don't ever talk to each other, they might never find out, and you can all of a sudden have all this free time that you can invest as you want. Um, uh, on the other hand, if you're seen as basically threatening because you're in a structural hole, you can go out of your way sometimes to deliberately reduce that sense of threatening by being helpful or polite or having, certain gracious, courteous air about you. So it doesn't mean that you're actually undercutting your own power all the time, though. There is, as we know, with any type of authority, there are ways in which if you don't enact it, you actually can lose it, right? It's a bit of a shadow on the wall. So what you can see, though, is these here to help attitudes can actually reduce the threat. But it may actually increase the pressure and demands that are on the people being helpful. But if your behavior is quite ambiguous where people can't read it, so this is the idea of basically someone who doesn't say a lot. It's often not clear what they're going for. They keep often their signals quite minimal. It can actually decrease the the pressure and increased potential power. There's a great article by Paget and Ansel that talks about the Medici family, and in particular the I can't remember which one it is. Anyway, if you go and look at it, it's actually pretty interesting. This idea of robust action, the idea that it's not entirely clear all the time what the head of the Medici family is doing, but he's doing it in a way that keeps everyone a little bit in the dark, and therefore is able to sort of amass power without destabilizing everything, at least initially. So another way to think about this is that in part, you often have to think about the links between B and C. So the last one thought about the power dynamics. This one just thinks about, again, how free A is to act or not. So in essence, one of the things that we found, right, when we played the games the first time we talked about these triads, was that if B and C can communicate, A is going to have to split money more evenly. Another way to think about that is that basically, if B and C are communicating, there are norms and oversight. Basically, there's an ability to oversee behavior and therefore constrain people to normative expectations. So a great example of this in the research literature is that if you imagine A as a high school student and B and C as the parents, so basically C is sort of A's parent and B is the parent of some friend of A. What you can find is that if the parents all know each other, the kids are much more likely to succeed in school and they're much less likely to get in trouble for breaking rules. Because in essence, if you try to sort of sneak out of the house and say you're going to go spend the night with somebody, but you really go to a party and you almost end up getting arrested, the parents are likely to find that out and stop it if they talk to each other. But if they don't talk to each other, A has much more freedom to act. So that's another aspect of this relationship that is important to know and take into account. So, but again, there's a trade-off because in a structural whole where you might have freedom, you aren't getting protection. So in essence, sort of B and C are both free to sort of not gang up, beat up you on their own, but they don't moderate their action, right? So they can demand and demand and demand. And also, you don't have this sort of united front that you can present. However, in case of structural constraint, you're often more protected, right? There's more of a chance that you'll have multiple people, basically multiple allies to be able to call on, and a sort of safer space to go to because you aren't having to constantly modulate and moderate and maintain a bunch of different feuding allies. So it's interesting. So one of the things that we should be looking for as people navigate these different power dynamics, in other words, is that when you're deliberately attempting to bring in some third party, right, either in your language or in your behavior, right? So in some cases, if we think back to the junta case, or even the way that, say, NIOSH, the NIOSH elevator pitch, in some cases, whenever somebody's saying, well, the banks, the federal government wants us to do this in the junta case, so therefore we sort of need to do it that way. That's sort of providing some rationale for the fact that they're going to actually be somewhat threatening in their behavior towards the banks. In the same way with NIOSH, they're sort of, in essence, reinforcing the power of the ADSO, and also, again, providing some rationale for what could be conceived as threatening behavior by putting tighter clamps down on the DDRC process. And they're basically saying, well, there are these outside people, they want it this way, so therefore we're going to be the brokers and we're going to sort of tell you what they want. It gives them power, and it simultaneously can sort of undercut. You'll see that that's going to certainly happen in this case. This attempt to sort of often reframe, well, this is what these people want. It also can normally constrain what the partner might be trying to do, right? Because they feel less free to threaten you. And again, it can provide greater freedom and power. So in essence, be on the lookout for the ways as actors navigate structural holes. They might be doing things both to either increase or decrease their sense of perceived power, depending on what they want the other person to do. And they might also be doing things about bringing in third parties, either verbally or actually in their behavior, like trying to actually bring them actively, like missing stakeholders into the process. And all of these behaviors can be interpreted is often trying to have some sort of strategic impact on other people's behaviors along these lines. So putting all this together then, when we think about what might happen as you're a new actor, right? That in essence, we've seen that it's often not enough to have formal power. You also need to sort of informally create a sense that people are going to need to do what you want them to do. So, right, we saw that pretty clearly in Brazil in action with the Treasury Department, that it wasn't enough to just have a set of rules, but that there needed to be ways, both sort of formal and informal, that there was some control put on whether or not the people spent the money correctly in Brazil in action. So actor certification, then, we're going to use as a term that we're going to use to describe this processual mechanism that will have many different things, right? Process features, so often things that an actor will do, or ways that a particular realization gets staged. And they can contribute to basically certifying the authority of the actor or the group that needs, or the program, right, that needs to get certified. As in, it sort of like the example we looked at with the bathroom signs, where in essence, because over and over again, right, you've gone through this process of getting used to the bathroom signs, people don't question it. It has a sort of taken for grantedness. And there's a shared perception that everyone else also recognizes that, right, which is important, because it's not enough that you know that that sign works that way. It's everyone else has to know it and also sort of be monitoring. And what this really does is going to increase the compliance with the sort of actor requests, or in this case, sort of the actual organizational routines that have been formally put in place. So as long as, again, given all else, as something becomes, as actors act in ways that make them be perceived as more powerful, and you can think about things like small wins, or again, having certain types, small wins is a big one, but basically having people endorse their actions, knowing that, you know, the president is there to sort of check in on you, etc. That all of these things basically sort of have this shared perception that particular people have the authority, and then people need to actually respect that, because it will be a problem. And it really does, actor certification basically gives an actor, the more perceived authority they have, the more they can operate in the structural whole without feeling the pressure, but having the power. And that's the important part of actor certification, is that basically part of it is what it's doing is it's certifying you to act in a certain way. Now, it can also be to get certified to be, say, I don't know, the gatekeeper to a particular person. That could also go through, but that would be a little bit more obvious. The actor certification we're going to think of is most, this term could apply to many things. We're most interested in the ways in which people basically gain the authority, the perceived authority, to operate in these structural holes that could grab power, but only if the conditions are right, right? Otherwise, they can actually be an incredible stress. So what types of things might we think of then as an actor certification process? We could think formally of things like, a formal actor certification would be something like recognition of a nation, or, you know, I just got a new course approved, right? That would be a sort of a course certification process. If you become accredited as a professional, the formal appointment of Servos, right? He's clearly been formally certified, not informally. And again, the formal certifications we can see help, but they don't always get you into really being able to act with authority. In fact, it can put you in a bit of a bind if you don't also have this informal authority. So the outcome of an informal authorization process is going to look more like widespread compliance, people who are actually, say, following laws, participating in elections, paying their taxes, whenever workers are, say, electing their leaders, are really like abstaining from sabotage, right? In the case of like at companies, so employees that are satisfied, or at the very least, you know, not dragging their feet in terms of compliance.